Hello, welcome to the second part of the discussion that I'm doing on God and Judgment Day and on our beliefs about such things. And I'm going to start off by discussing the case of evolution and creationism. And I think it's a really important aspect of belief in Judgment Day and in God, because belief about where our origins are and where we came from to begin with are also tied up with, connected to beliefs about the end and where we're heading and progressing towards. Sort of what happened at the beginning of the world is tied into our beliefs about what happens at the end of it, I suppose. Because if there's a purpose at the beginning of the world, then it stands to reason also there's a purpose in the middle and the end as well. So those things seem to be somehow connected, at least. Our beliefs about our origins and the beginnings, and our beliefs about possible endings as well. Well, there's a huge dispute, of course, over creationism versus evolution. But it often neglects the argument of why, if there's a reason why the universe may have been created. It tends to focus more on how the universe was created. And evolutionists have formed a theory, as I would call it, over many decades, centuries perhaps even. And very much they look at how the world was allegedly evolved, what were the scientific processes involved, and how things were formed over a long period of time. Of course, their theory is that it took many millions of years for different species to evolve into other things, and that if you go back far enough as an extension, that everything was evolved materialistically from a single point of origin. They trace back to the Big Bang. So that's, in a nutshell, I suppose, its theory. Well, now, there's a certain kind of evolution that has certainly occurred that even creationists will agree with. So it depends what we define evolution as. If we look at the variation of different types of dogs or cats, even, you look at the different type of dogs that there are today. They could all be traced back to common ancestor, perhaps of a wolf of some sort. But there's such incredible variation of different sizes and colours and shapes. But they all have the same biological point of similarity. So although there's incredible variation, still they are the same species. And it's true enough of human beings, in fact. We have different races. We have over millenniums evolved to have different colours, different shapes, different size noses, different eye colours, different hair types, different sort of facial structures. And of course, that may have evolved for various reasons, according to the different climates that we've been living in. No doubt that can affect our pigmentation and our race, of course. If you have a group of people that have been living for thousands of years in a colder climate, genetically breeding, and other people that have been breeding in a much hotter climate for a very long period of time, you would expect there to be certain differences gradually that have distinguished different groups from each other over a long period. That's true, we recognise that, but at the same time, biologically speaking, they're still the same species, whatever variation there may be. We still have the same brain and heart, all the different organs of the body that are the same. We still have those same genetic components too. And so there is this type of evolution that even creationists will believe in. That creationists would say that since the world was created, various species have been evolving differently within their particular species. But what they say they don't accept is that one species has evolved to that of a different species. That the evolution is within each species rather than between them. So that's the point of contention. Not that there is or isn't evolution itself, but the type and kind of evolution that we're talking about. So even creationists do believe in a kind of evolution, of course, but they don't believe that one species today has evolved from a different species today, that they have a common ancestor. So they therefore don't believe that humans and monkeys have a common ancestral species that they both evolved from. They believe that they were created differently. And so it's important to know that that's what the different theories are, not to sort of model those two different kinds of evolution as one, because they're quite distinct and different ideas in and of themselves. Evolutionists do have a sort of quite an accurate portrayal of what they say has happened over many billions of years, that the world has gradually been evolving, different life forms evolved from very primitive states into much more complex beings. Whereas, in fact, creationists don't seem to often have an accurate picture that they can give people as to how it occurred, except short of saying perhaps that God did it in some way, but they don't say exactly how. Or maybe it's only described, in very vague or poetic language, but it's not the actual scientific processes through which maybe God had done it, aren't described in the actual detail of how it was possible. So it might be difficult to accept a theory without knowing any of those accurate details. I suppose most creationists would be content to say we're willing to accept something happened without necessarily having to know the exact details of how it was possible. And indeed, you can accept things in life are possible without having to necessarily know exactly how that was achieved. But we can look at the various claims that evolutionists make and see and assess whether they are credible or not. I personally would say that there is just too little information to go on. There's just way too little evidence that their claim that various species are related to earlier ancestral species, and that there just seems to be a poverty of evidence to actually confirm that. Because you might expect there to be if you have these two different species, you're saying were linked, one type of species, a Neanderthal early type of man, and then modern day man, then you might say there would be all these various intermediary species throughout the different stages of the development between those two. But there seems to be a complete lack of any evidence. Now, there are some claims about various small fragments of different types of bone, where they've made various reconstructions using those various fragments, but they're very limited and they tend to be the exception to the rule. And even those are disputed amongst various scientists, how accurate those are. But I'm not saying that a lack of that evidence disproves evolution, for me at least. And the reason why is because I wouldn't expect there to be a lot of evidence from earlier species, just for the fact of the matter that decomposition is a natural process that exists around us and has done for thousands of years. So that earlier bodies, for the most part, of all different kinds of species, would naturally degrade, either be decomposed or be eaten by other animals. That's the natural order. That's the natural phenomenon that tends to take place. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that, where we preserve a body. So human bodies tend to be preserved in a coffin, and until that's naturally degraded and broken down, then it becomes consumed by other animals, the worms get into it, etc., etc. That's the natural decomposition process that things happen. So we wouldn't expect there to be evidence from many years ago. And in fact, the further you go back, we would expect there to be much less and less evidence, not just of different types of species, including humans, but also, of course, of earlier civilizations in terms of the structures that they were building. Wooden buildings, for example, buildings of straw or of mud. We wouldn't expect there to be all the evidence of earlier civilizations, because they would naturally break down and degrade as time goes on. So, absence of evidence isn't in itself evidence for absence. So I don't claim to have any evidence to either prove or disprove evolution from my point of view anyway. I just say that they don't have an overwhelming amount of evidence that actually proves beyond any reasonable doubt that evolution is true. That's my own take on it, really. But equally, one could say that there's no actual complete evidence to prove either that there is a creation and that therefore there is a creator. Or there's at least disputed evidence. One other area that people tend to cite as being good evidence to justify evolution, and the common claim that we and monkeys or gorillas, that type of family, that we have a common ancestral link, is that we do share very similar or high degree of genetic components with them. And I think that is true scientifically, we do. Compared to other species, we've got a very high degree of genetic similarities to other mammals compared to other species like fish, but in particular, specifically to other monkeys. So you could say that is evidence that we had a common ancestor, but that's just interpretation of that evidence. A creationist would interpret that evidence through intelligent design, and they would say, well, when an architect is designing various things, they would tend to use quite similar designs in their different aspects of creation. So, for example, if an architect is designing different houses and the types of houses that he's constructing, he might use a very similar model for one type of house to another one. And one would expect that quite understandably in the geometric designing of different architectural houses. You might use a very similar model for some types of houses, and yet one that's quite different, because you're using the same kind of ideas as a template to create different things from. And that is true for humans as creators. When we are creating different things, we will borrow from other things that we've created and use similar kind of designs and templates for different things. So, whether you see that as evidence for our similarity in genetic components to other species, you could interpret that as evidence for an earlier species that had the same genetic components to both. But, it could easily be interpreted by creationists as evidence actually for an intelligent designer who uses similar design models in which to create different designs. So, it's funny how you can see by using the same kind of evidence, people will interpret it according to what their own beliefs are, really. Really, I don't know that it ultimately, on its own, conclusively confirms either theory beyond any doubt, that is. It could be interpreted either way, actually. So it's an interesting one. I don't think that there's proof beyond any doubt for either evolution or creation myself. Evolution is certainly a prominent theory and widely believed at the moment. But of course it is disputed by many people. But there are many people that still believe in evolution, but also believe in God. And the two things are not mutually exclusive, in fact. So, people that have got a theological belief, from whatever background that is, whether they're Judeo-Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, agnostic, pagan, whatever other type of theistic belief they might have, many people that have some sort of belief in God also believe in evolution as well. So, theistic people are divided in believing, some of them for creation, and some of them believe in evolution. That God created the Big Bang and that everything has evolved from there, and others believe, that there was no millions of years of evolution or Big Bang, and that God created the world in some other way, perhaps. Many people that believe in evolution still have and retain a belief in God. The two things aren't mutually exclusive. Although I would probably say that there are a large number of evolutionists as well that are probably atheists, or perhaps agnostic atheists, perhaps. But there are many people I'd recognise that still believe in evolution and still also have a belief in God as well, as being a creator. But that their understanding of creation is perhaps different to other people's understanding of creation. And from my point of view, I'd say I just don't know how God created the world, but I do believe that the world was created for purpose, for reason, and that we are here therefore for a reason. To go back to that issue of the Big Bang, actually, if we assume that evolution is to be true, and let's say that there was once a Big Bang, that life itself, the whole universe, was created at one point by this sort of starting point, that everything evolved from that, expanding outwards. I think that's what the theory is. But then naturally one would want to logically ask, what created the Big Bang? Or what created the thing that created the Big Bang? And so on. You could keep saying, is there ever a start point? Can you ever have, logically speaking, ever a start point at which things ultimately could be traced back to? Can there ever be a 0 point? Because surely philosophically, surely there can never quite be a start point, because that would assume that nothing created that start point somehow. And I personally don't see philosophically how you can ever have a singular start point for anything, really. That sort of doesn't make sense to me. The fact that we cannot logically have a single start point without implying some sort of magical nothingness that could create everything, that would imply that there was something eternal, something that was somehow beyond our understanding or beyond the realms of what we consider time to be. Even if we accept there must be something that is eternal, though, otherwise we fall into this illogical trap that somehow a nothingness can create everything. But even if we accept that there must be some sort of eternal realm of some sort, beyond the constraints of time, of the universe, that itself is not necessarily an argument for God. One could imagine, for example, a never-ending or never-beginning type of physics that is ever continually transforming itself. So thus the real debate, in fact, as I see it, is whether this is a purely material world that is only physical, or whether we are living in one that is actually somehow, whatever you would call it, a soulful or spiritual, or one that has a consciousness of some sort. But however we define that, at the heart of this debate is whether we have a soul ourselves, or some essence beyond the purely materialistic being. If we accept that we do have some kind of soul, however we define it, then it implies that we all do. And this then leads to the question, where do our souls come from? What is their purpose? Where are we going? That then begs numerous questions. If one believes that there is no soul, but that is just a fiction, one can be content to merely have this mechanical, physical, biological world. But before we decide on whether this is or is not, one needs to be sure, what are we accepting or rejecting first? If we don't fully understand what something is, then are we able to either accept or reject it to begin with? So it seems sensible to begin an investigation from an agnostic point of view, neither assuming that we know or don't know what a soul is. Because we can't accept or reject something without having some basic understanding first of what it actually is, of what the claims about it are. I don't personally, myself though, like the idea of having a soulless life, something that is only physical or an object. I would find that quite insulting myself. I don't like the idea of being just a thing, or other people being just things either. I don't feel like a thing, an object, but rather I feel like a subject, an individual, subjected to the various things that we experience within our life. As the ancient philosophers say, I am not somebody, but I have somebody. Or perhaps another way of saying it, however one looks at it, is that I am within somebody, or it has me, perhaps. But however one looks at it, rather than identifying as the body alone. For millenniums, various theologians, philosophers, and artists have seen the body not as themselves, but as the home for themselves or their soul, or as a shell, to describe it in a metaphorical language. In the case of an illness, it might seem, in fact, like a prison that one is trapped within, although one might view it in a more positive light, perhaps in a metaphor as a vehicle. A person to a car is almost like a person to a soul, because the body without the person is lifeless, is a corpse, has no movement, is an empty vessel, like a car that has no person. Although I understand now that they are designing driverless cars, but it's nice to think of ourselves as being the driver of our body. Although sometimes you can feel like the passenger of it, I suppose, if driven by bodily desires sometimes, I suppose. But the idea of being reduced to some object is in itself quite an offensive thing when you think about it, because it denies the subjectivity of our experience, that we are, each of us, individuals. To view others as an object, or in the modern sense, a robot, is to deny the emotional dimension that man goes through and experiences, his pains and his pleasures, his sorrows and his joys, and all the various spectrum of different feelings that he'll go through, and the effect of all those different experiences. To treat anyone as if they were an object merely to be used, and not acknowledging the emotional reality of their emotional being, this often, and indeed so often, leads us into suffering, where we allow ourselves to be treated like a thing and don't accept or acknowledge the emotional consequence of how we allow ourselves to be treated, or conversely, indeed how we treat other people. In fact, it's quite hurtful to be treated just like an object, as if we don't have any feelings, isn't it? Consider the idea of sex. If somebody uses you purely just for sex, actual fact, without looking at your emotional feelings, it can be quite hurtful, if they're just using you for their own gratification and their own desires, rather than actually wanting to have a deeper, more connected, emotional relationship with you as well, that's able to sort of fulfill and give you that emotional nurturing support. That's ideally what, a good, healthy relationship would aspire towards, isn't it? Rather than some sort of shallow one where we just merely use each other in an unfulfilling way that's just sort of driven by purely base and bodily desires. It's sort of animalistic almost. One would want to aspire to something more emotional and fulfilling, to be nurtured, one that's mutually fulfilling indeed. But it's not just in the realm of sexuality. It's also when you think about you're going to work, you want to have certain rights that we would all want, ones that would recognize our needs, both physically and also emotionally. The need that we have not to be overworked and overloaded, emotionally as well as physically, because some jobs can be quite demanding physically and also mentally. So we would want a certain level of human rights within the workplace. We would expect that for ourselves and hopefully also for other people too. And, it's when we treat other people like robots that are disposable and replaceable, it's deeply harmful and causes a huge amount of suffering. Where we recognize that our own rights, emotionally, mentally, physically, that are also what other people have too, and that's something that we all need and we all have a right and desire to. And so if you look at the idea of, allowing other people and ourselves as to be seen as only objects in life, it really is something that allows us to erode our treatment of other people in not acknowledging that they have emotional feelings, that they have pains, pleasures, that they have needs. And if those needs aren't met to a certain degree, they have consequences. It causes a lot of pain and suffering to someone. And so, I think one has to be wary about an ideology that somehow sort of can be used to promote things that are deeply harmful and allow suffering, actually. Recognizing each other's emotional needs, our mental needs, our physical needs. I think that's a very healthy thing. And recognizing also that we all have those is something that binds us together, isn't it, really? It would be quite divisive to say some people had those and other people don't. I think actually, when you're honest, you recognise that everybody has a certain amount of common basic needs. We all have a need to eat food, to breathe oxygen, to drink water, to have a certain adequate amount of sleep, not to be deprived. And that if we're deprived of those basic material needs, we can suffer. But it's equally true to say if we're deprived of certain basic emotional needs, we could suffer too. And that we all would under certain extreme conditions. So I think if you look at the whole ideology of it only being purely a material world that's only objects, that denies that reality that we're all emotional beings, that we all have those feelings, and I think that's it's really critical to do that, not just in defending our own rights, but those of others too. That we would expect and want those for all of us, actually. So I think it's for me important to look at the ideology of things and how that supports various other things, connecting different ideologies and how they relate to our own experiences and those of others too. There are those that would deny that we have got a soul or spirit, however one defines it, of course. And there's a huge amount of debate within that. There's a debate about whether, one, there is such a thing as a soul. But other people would debate it agnostically and say, even though they might accept that there is such a thing as a soul, they might have varying different competing ideas as to what their understanding of it is. There may be various different ideas about that. Interestingly, debates about the soul actually seem quite similar to those about God somehow. And the objections that people make to there being a soul are actually quite similar to the objections people make to there being a God as well. People will say, for example, there's a lack of absolute scientific proof to justify belief in it. Well, that depends on what you accept as proof, I suppose. But nobody has ever seen a soul. No one's ever studied it under the microscope, for example. But you might say that you've seen or you felt personal experience of it, however subjective in nature that might be. But you might also relate to other people's personal experiences of it too. So, and there's a huge debate about whether there is scientific proof or not, and what constitutes as science or pseudoscience. And I think that's probably contended to some extent. And the fact that there are many different competing ideas about it, about what the soul or the nature of the soul is. Well, that's true of God as well, isn't it? There are various different competing claims, although some of them naturally do overlap as well. But the fact that there are many different ideas about something, that doesn't mean that that thing in itself doesn't have any validity. That would call on us to assess and discern and try to look at what those different ideas are and to consider how valid we would estimate those things are. One has to be cautious that we're not just trying to look for ideas that already conform to our own preconceived beliefs, but to try and look and assess at whether our beliefs are justified by what evidence there is in life. But that, of course, relies on us to look at what evidence is, of course. Some people might say it seems all too incredible, fantastical indeed, to claim and to believe in something like God. The idea of this supreme, unseen being with supernatural powers just seems too fanciful, just too ridiculous, too miraculous, just too incredible to even believe. But just like the soul, the idea of there being such a thing as a soul itself may seem just too incredible for us to believe, because the idea that I'm an invisible being that doesn't have an actual material body but lives within a material body, the idea of my essence being something that cannot easily be reduced to a scientific understanding that may even be beyond the realms of science, the idea that I and what I in essence am may be something that is beyond the realms of being understood, the idea that we all may be. It may well seem to be a fantastical thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. We need to sort of look at how credible it might or might not be. So I think it's really important for us to look back at